Hello. Yeah. Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Good morning to all of you. I hope I am audible and I'm visible to everyone. Now, today we'll be discussing 5 to 6 very important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. Today we have very interesting articles also dealing with the judiciary, GS paper 1, GS paper 2 and 3. Now, before we begin, I hope that you've used this very important opportunity, which is Civil Services Day offer, in which you are getting a subscription to our family for 20,000 or 19,999 plus 12 months extension. Remember, you have to use the code IAS English because this will allow us to be you to be tagged to our team in that regard. So using the code IS English is going to be extremely important. And this offer is a limited period offer. Important. Please do use it. This is the lowest we've ever gone. We have 22,999 previously as the offer. Now 19,999. Use this offer and use the code IS English to be tagged to our team. Now, if you want the PPT to this session, you have to scan this QR code and join this Telegram channel. Now, when we talk about the 7 articles, they're quite interesting in the way that we have to discuss the criticism with regards to the judiciary. Then we'll talk about a very interesting development which has happened, something which was predictable, which is China changing its export policy with regards to rare earth metals. Then we'll talk about the concept of a creative economy. Very interesting that way. Then coming out of a very important expert, somebody who has managed China and a foreign secretary, former foreign secretary, the way we need to understand China and India relationship with regards to completing 75 years. Then we lost a very important personality for the Christian world and generally for humanity, which is Pope Francis. We'll discuss what was his major, you can say, decisions and the way he changed the perception of the church itself. Then we'll talk about SpadeX being repeated again, something confirming our prowess with regards to docking, and Jammu and Kashmir UT also now feeling the wrath of nature and something which has in turn led to NH1 and most of the sector being affected because of the flash floods and the landslips which has happened recently. We'll discuss these 7 articles. I hope all of us are comfortable and good morning to all of you. We'll begin our understanding with regards to the judiciary, and this article basically talks about two very important things. Now, with Yashwant Verma case and multiple other things happening in and around India right now, judicial independence, judicial transparency, opaqueness in that regard is now under focus. Now, sometimes it is very hard to articulate the criticism towards the judiciary because you may sound disrespectful. And this is where this article is quite interesting because it does two things. It articulates the criticism for you and also tells you if the criticism is actually justified or not. This is where it all stems from the vice president's speech in which he talked about how judicial space and judicial activism and judiciary in India as of right now is in a questionable ground. And therefore, how do we articulate the criticism towards judiciary and is it actually called for or uncalled for in that regard? This is the basic gist of this article, very well structured in that regard and gives us an opportunity to have a very informative but also very civil, you can say, understanding and conversation about judicial independence, opaqueness and transparency. So what did the vice president say about the judiciary just after the judgment came from the Supreme Court with regards to Tamil Nadu, and how the president and the governors have been directed for a certain timeline when a bill is kept for the assent of the president by the governor of a state? And therefore we have identified 4 areas which can be seen as the spaces of criticism for the judiciary. The first one is lack of transparency. This is how you are going to quote it in the examination, write it in the mains perspective also. First is lack of transparency, and here there are two things. One is the collegium issue, which is appointments, and at the same point of time, the second thing which is being talked about is the Yashwant Verma case, wherein how is the inquiry happening is also happening in closed door. So the question is with regards to the Delhi High Court Judge Ashwin Verma, the inquiry is being done by his own peers. There is no third party intervention. and therefore the judiciary inquiring into the judiciary itself, the conflict of interest. So the question is, should there be a third party independent inquiry over Yashwant Verma rather than having the judiciary inquiring into or also checking the judiciary itself? This is a very interesting, you can say, criticism. And this is where there is a lot of issues with regards to the image of the judiciary. As of right now, in India, we have a lot of faith in judiciary. We believe that anything and everything can be sorted out in courts. We believe in the courts. But the judicial space as of right now and the judges' conduct is now in question. And there is a need to sanitize this space because of the fact that NJAC was struck down by the Supreme. The judiciary is saying that our understanding, be it the first judge's case, second judge's case, or third judge's case, they have said that our appointments are binding on the president itself. The 99th Amendment was introduced in order to change this idea where there should be further, you can say, contribution and participation of third party perspective. However, the collegium issue is something which is still holding. So the NJAC issue versus the collegium issue still holds. And this is where now this conversation has been reoriented and refurbished. On the other hand, Yashwant Verma has added more questions to this pool of questions because he and his conduct and the money which has been found within his house and the general perspective which people have started to develop about judges is now treading in the territory where judicial independence, transparency, and opaqueness is now being questioned left, right, and center. It is too opaque. This is where the first criticism stands. This is not my opinion, this is the opinion of the author. The author argues that here there is a problem. If this is a criticism, lack of transparency, there has to be judicial reform, and that has to come from the judiciary itself. Because any form of reform from the executives or the legislative sector has in turn led to either quoting the basic structure or being struck down by the Supreme Court generally. So, therefore, lack of transparency is something which is being considered to be problematic. Now, this space stands, meaning if you write this point in such a way in the examination, you will be able to get a good perspective through, and also the examiner will not feel that you are doing something where you're questioning one of the pillars of democracy in India. So, therefore, lack of transparency and vis-a-vis transparency of appointment and inquiry is something which stands. Now comes the second criticism, which was something which in turn led to the vice president to say what he said, which is that recently in a judgment, the Supreme Court has argued that if a bill is passed by the state legislation and from state legislature it goes to the governor has the right under Article 201 to reserve his assent and rather send this for to the president for assent. Now, this is where under Article 201, it is believed that there is absolute veto to the president because Article 201 does not spell out what is the time period in which he has to send the assent back or the bill back through his signature. Meaning, he can get the bill in January. There, it does not say when he has to, in a way, send that bill back or if he has to also. Therefore, there is no time period prescribed by the Constitution for a bill reserved for the president's assent by the governor, which in turn means that the president can indefinitely hold on to a bill, in turn also conniving with the governor to hold on to critical legislation, which there may be because the governor is an agent of the center as argued in the concept of what we call as the federalism of India, that he's appointed by the center, he's an executive member. Therefore, there can be and there has been a lot of delay, and 7 different bills were being withheld by the governor of Tamil Nadu over this issue of that it has been sent to the president. The president is not sending it back. And this is where the Supreme Court has reprimanded both these executives, the president and the governor, that you have to take action within a prescribed timeline for which they have said 3 months. 3 months is the prescribed timeline in which if a bill has been sent from the governor to the president, it has to be sent back within 3 months. Any delay has to be explained. And if the president is still not sending it, or the governor is not asking for the bill, then we will use mandamus, which is we command that we will use mandamus. The state legislation, the state CM has the right to use a writ petition under mandamus to then ask for action on the bill itself. Now, this is where there's a lot of, you can say, conversation with regards to how the Supreme Court is now dictating to the executives what is their role. So the idea is Tamil Nadu issue in turn has led to this very big conversation, a discourse being created that can the Supreme Court actually argue and direct the president under Article 201 to send a bill back within 3 months or with the time limit of 3 months, and any explanation can be then it needs to be explained to the state legislation. Further, the use of a writ petition under mandamus is something which is considered extraordinary. That in the federal structure, the state CM is applying under writ petition that there is a bill which is with the governor, it has been sent to the president, there's no inaction, and the judiciary will say, okay, we will ask, we command to the executive to act in the way they should. And this is where the second criticism is something which has been considered to be judicial overreach. Now, according to the author, this is not an overreach. According to the author of this article, this is not an overreach. It very categorically says that this is within the right of the Supreme Court, and it may not use mandamus itself, but but this is within the right of the Supreme Court to direct to the governor and to the president to give assent in a given time frame. Even the memorandum which has been issued by the Home Secretary and the MHA says that there has to be a certain time limit within which the state has to receive the assent back from the president or the governor. So, this is where the second criticism is not overreach, it is expected and it is within the judicial limit. I'll tell you why. Because we have a very interesting case where there is a concept of parliamentary supremacy and the concept of judicial supremacy. And we are basically in a space where we have the concept of constitutional sovereignty. So parliamentary sovereignty and judicial sovereignty together interacting with one another, which is the parliament sovereign right and the judicial supremacy. They interact with one another to produce a space in India where we have a hybrid model in which I'll discuss. The British and the American models interact to create a space where something like this can happen. Something like this can happen. And therefore, the second argument or the second criticism does not stand because it is within the right of the Supreme Court, within the constitutional bounds to therefore direct to the governor and the president under Article 201 to do something like that. Are we on the same page with regards to the first and the second? Then I'll move to the third and the fourth. Are we understanding how the article is structured and how you can use all of this in the examination? Yes? First concept, lack of transparency. Second concept, can prescribed timelines be given by the Supreme Court to the executives? Thereafter, we're coming to that, Nishant. Now, the third criticism is the concept of federalism comes to because we have a state legislation over which we have a central agent or a person who's appointed by the center. So it is a moment of center-state relationship. Now, the third criticism is lack of accountability towards the people generally. Now, this one is a unique one where the vice president has argued. I'll discuss what is parliamentary sovereignty and all of that. Just let me develop this concept further. I will discuss the hybrid model with you. Now, this is a very interesting and unique argument which he has pushed through, which is for constitutional matters, a 5-judge bench is needed for any very important issue of constitutional validity. But when the strength of the Supreme Court was 8, 5-judge bench made sense. Made sense. He says that now with the present strength of 34, there is a need to reconsider this idea. Why cannot we have bigger benches for constitutional matters? This is the first argument. This one needs to be considered by the judiciary because it makes sense. When we had a bench or we had the strength of 8, 5 was considered important. But with 34 judges within the Supreme Court as of right now, according to the Vice President, there needs to be reconsideration. There needs to be reconsideration that maybe we can have a 10 judge, 12 judge, 15 judge bench. This is where 5, 7, and 8 makes no sense, according to him. And there is a need to further open up this concept, allowing for more perspectives coming through on constitutional matters. Lack of accountability of the judiciary towards the general public is something which is considered to be problematic generally, that the judicial space is in a way immune to most of the checks and balances. And this is where the idea is that there needs to be internal reform, because you all know very well any external reform will be resisted and will in turn lead to either that legislation or that whatever it may be it an executive order, it will be struck down by the Supreme. The idea is there is a need for introspection. With introspection, there needs to be reform. But that reform has to come with the idea that now the judges are not 8 but 34. And therefore, this is a very interesting argument and stands that yes, we may introduce concepts which make them more accountable. And at the same point of time, we can also make sure that we have a bigger bench for very important matters. Last but not the least is the question that the judicial activism which happens under Article 142, which is complete justice concept, is it really the need of the hour? Or should the power of the Supreme Court under 142 be taken away because of judicial activism into spaces where they should not enter? The fact that the judiciary is dictating to the executives and to the legislature, is it judicial activism? Here, the author provides enough evidence to argue that 142 has done more good than any form of overreach or activism. That is again a very subjective argument of the author, which is that if we talk about the Bhopal gas tragedy, if we talk about sexual harassment in the workplace, if we talk about the coal block mines, the auction itself, if we talk about the permanent commission for women within the armed forces, all were under 142, where the Supreme Court intervened and did good. So therefore, the argument of the vice president that 142 is something which is becoming problematic does not really stand according to the author, because 142 has done more good than maybe certain points of overreach. There will always be this conflict and this tension between the judiciary and the executive, which is the basic model on which the constitution is based on. When I'm coming to that basic concept which is embodied in our constitution, which in turn leads to this conflict. But now understand these points. Four criticism have been talked about. Two are very similar, which is the transparency issue, which is opaqueness with regards to appointment and inquiry. Both these stand, which is there is a need for introspection and change. There's a need to change the understanding itself. Thereafter, when we talk about the second and the third or the other two criticisms, 142 and the idea that timelines cannot be prescribed by the Supreme Court, stand because both of these are within the power of the Supreme Court in that regard. So this one, which is the timeline, the recent, you can say, case, plus the idea of 142, both stand. On the other hand, the idea that there is a need for introspection, yes. So two criticisms stand, two criticisms are just executive frustration in that regard. So do understand this point very clearly. Do understand this point very clearly, that this is how you write an answer. This is why I have given you this data or this article in verbatim, because you have to use these words: lack of accountability, lack of transparency, timeline issue. Is judicial activism problematic under 142? Now, what is the core issue here? And this is where the author argues that we are basically using a hybrid model, under which we have something called parliamentary sovereignty, which is the supremacy of laws passed by the parliament. This comes out of the British model, which we absorbed via writing a constitution. And at the same point of time, we have one more model in place, which is called judicial supremacy, which we picked up from the American Constitution, where if due process of law has been followed, the Supreme Court and the courts have wide ranging powers. And this is where the Indian case lies in the intersection of both of these, which is the concept that we have what is called as constitutional sovereignty, which is the constitution is supreme, and both the executives and the judiciary have the right to be within their space if their values are embodied by the constitution, which is the constitution is supreme. Supremacy of the constitution is established over and above the parliament being supreme or the judiciary being supreme. Judiciary will block anything under basic structure. It is the right of the executives and the legislature, which is the parliament, to question the right of the judiciary to block anything under basic structure. But at the same point of time, constitutional sovereignty or supremacy of constitution is something which is coming out of this hybrid model. So the author argues that this inherent conflict between the executives and the judiciary is inherent to the structure which we have adopted. So therefore, this will be a constant back and forth. Is 142 problematic for the executive? Yes. But is it within the right of the Supreme Court? Yes. Is the idea that the Supreme Court can prescribe to the president that you have to send a law back to the governor and to the state legislature within 3 months is within the right of the Supreme Court. That comes from the idea of judicial supremacy. But is there the right to have NJSC and also executive oversight over appointments of the judges? Yes, that is within the right of the parliamentary supremacy because the parliament is also supreme. So this is where, because we have an intersection of these two concepts, we create the idea of constitutional supremacy. Any value or anything which prescribes to the value of the constitution as embodied by the preamble or any other article, be the DPSP or be the what we call as fundamental rights, then it is within the right of the constitution to do it. That is why I told you this is a very interesting article. For the first time, we have a very nuanced argument which has come through. So there is a certain current context. There are multiple criticisms, but judicial review, independence, and judicial activism is all within the right, but is actually a product of this intersection of due process of law of the American Constitution and the supremacy of the parliament, which comes out of the British Constitution. So therefore, if you get a question like this in the examination, which says the judiciary as a pillar of democracy needs to sanitize its image in the wake of recent controversies, you are not going to do loose talk, which is randomly say that we cannot trust the judges cannot be trusted, they are corrupt, they are taking a lot of money. All of that does not stand. You have to use a nuanced argument and argue that this conflict, this issue is coming out of the way the constitution creates these two pillars, which is the executives and the judiciary, will always be in conflict. There will always be a little bit of friction because they are checking and balancing each other. And therefore, 142 is within the right of the Supreme Court. There is judicial activism, yes, but in the right space, in multiple cases, we have seen that. So, very simply, if it is within the constitutional value, then it is correct. So, in this question, you have to talk about lack of accountability. If you talk about how there are questions on appointments and inquiry, you also have to talk about there have been multiple cases where 142 has been criticized, but 142 and judicial, you can say, activism in certain spaces is justified and is a constitutional value itself. However, the way they sanitize their image is through internal introspection, change, and understanding in them. So I hope you understand this. You can have multiple opinions on this. You may not agree with the author. You may not agree with the author. I'm not asking you to be something where you are agreeing with the author itself, but I'm asking you to at least pick up something which is important given in this article and use it for your mains answer. I think you can do that at least. Where you may think that 142 is problematic. You also may think that there is need for further judicial reform. There is a lot of support for NJC. NJC makes sense also. But the Supreme Court will never allow for that. Collegium is problematic. I've discussed this on the same platform that collegium creates more issues. And therefore, please do understand one thing, which is that the judicial space cannot be fully in the control of the executive, but the judiciary can also not just be an opaque space where there is no reform or inquiry. Do we understand this? Do we understand this article? You'll be able to answer and write a nuanced answer for this practice question. Yes? Again, you may agree or disagree with the author, totally the concepts which the article is talking about in that regard. Yes? See, collegium can only be questioned by the executive. There has collegium, be it the first judge's, second or third judge's case, all three are problematic. And the way the judiciary have closed themselves will create more questions only. There is a need for change, but any external change will in turn lead to this concept of what we call as the idea that we have basic structure cannot be touched. It has to be introspection. Judiciary has to do something about its image because there is a lot of questions being asked. So British model and American model dichotomy creates this intersection, creates a constitutional sovereignty. Constitutional values are the most important. Yes, very good. Now, the second article is quite interesting, which is that this was something which we were predicting is going to happen, which is China recently has blocked the export of rare earth metals. And rare earth metals are extremely important for all new technological advancement and our whole modern society today and technology is based on rare earth metal. Now, we'll understand two things first, which is what is rare earth metal and what is the Chinese monopoly over it. And then we'll discuss how important it is for the US and then how it impacts India. So three different parts in that regard. As always, I'll keep on trying to give you summaries so that you don't have to revise later. You will revise with me here itself. Now, the recent trade war between US and China has escalated to this point where the supply chain for rare earth metals has now, which is mostly controlled by China, there has been now a certain mandate within China itself that we should control the supply chain, but we have to tighten the tap a little bit. And the export of rare earth metals towards the US is now being controlled and has been blocked to some level. Basically, they are creating artificial shortage to show to the US how important the Chinese are to the whole supply chain. Again, within CNA itself, we have had a long conversation about this. 86% of all exports to all, basically 86% of all rare earth metals, which is in circulation as of right now, comes from China itself. And therefore, Chinese have a pure monopoly over this thing. Now, the question is, what are the rare earth metals? They are not rare per se within the Earth's crust. But the problem is the way you need to refine these rare earth metals is very specific, and that is where China has a monopoly. Close to 44 million tons of rare earth metal is held by the Chinese. Then it is Brazil, then India. And thereafter, the US only has 1.9 million tons of rare earth metals. Therein, there is a 40% or 40, rather 40 times there's a difference between what the US has and the Chinese have. And over and above that, the problem is not that it is not available in other countries. India also has developed mines, and we have lithium mines being found in Jammu and Kashmir. The problem is refining them. Yes, Nitin. That is the whole point, that it is the isolation of this metal. Getting lithium from the ore itself is very, very difficult. And that technology, mostly the Chinese or the Japanese are holding as of right now. And it is not that we cannot extract, it is cost effective. Meaning, if China is able to extract it for $40 per gram, we can do it, but it will be something which will be exponentially expensive. Maybe we'll do it for $100 in that. And that is something which is not sustainable in the long run. Now we'll talk about the Indian angle later. But when we talk about the rare earth metals over which China has actually now created a target, meaning over and above that target, you cannot export out of China, basically controlling the export. One is needed in hard disks and car motors, which is dysprosium. Then we have gadolinium, which is needed for medical equipment. Then we have, you don't have to learn this, but just to show you how important these metals are. Lithium is used in PET scanners and petroleum refining. We have selenium, which is used for magnets, candium, which is used in aircraft, or terbium, which is used in personal electronics, and yttrium, which is used in superconductors. Basically, all these metals are critical for defense, medical, automobile, and any form of technology based development. Any form. And if you actually look at this, which is how does US use these rare earth metals? 62% of petroleum refining, catalytic converters, chemical processing, these rare earth metals are needed by the US. 62% goes into just catalysts, 6% in treatment, 3% in display and screens, 7% in magnets, 9% in ceramics, and 13% in metallurgy. With Lockheed Martin and all what we call as forerunners in the defense market being in America itself, they need the rare earth metal. This is the dependence of the US over the Chinese rare earth metal market. And with regards to semiconductors, which are the future, it is extremely important. We also have rare earth metals, but we only have certain rare earth metals, which I'll talk about. But the idea is Trump is not thinking of this before he is acting. Trump just thinks that tariffs can be weaponized. Weaponization of trade can in turn lead to the Chinese coming to the negotiating table. However, the Chinese have realized one thing very early in their relationship with the US. The US needs China more than the Chinese needing the US, because China is a supplier of the world. Yes, 15% of the trade is held by the Chinese, and the American trade of the world is 15%. And you must have heard of that, or you've seen that clip in which the Chinese minister is saying, "We don't care. We don't care. This 15% can be diversified and then sent into different markets rather than just depending on the US in that regard." A lot of bonds, a lot of money which is invested into the American market is also Chinese. And therefore, the US is not realizing one thing. Trump is specifically not realizing something. This can paralyze the economy. Why can it, or how does it actually paralyze it? Because if these metals are going to be in short supply, their whole market is going to be disrupted, and the same thing is going to become even more expensive with 245% of tariff plus rare earth metal. This was something which was going to happen for sure, but the Chinese used a very strategic point where Trump has paused these tariffs with everyone for 90 days, but the Chinese are still saying that we'll fight till the end. Now this is where the US perspective comes. Now where does India stand in this trade? And the idea and what the government of India is arguing is there is no immediate impact. There is no immediate impact. However, there is a need to diversify our, you can say, importing destinations, or what we call as suppliers, because the Chinese hold all the cards as of right now. And previously, there has been an article in the Hindu newspaper again, which argues that within India, close to 90% of all rare earth metal refined comes from China itself. Now, what is the way forward? because a UPSC aspirant has to always write a way forward. What is the government of India trying to do? The government of India has a policy which is called the National Critical Minerals Mission. Within critical minerals, we have the concept of rare earth metals. And India is trying to now develop what we call as refining technology within India itself. It is also trying to diversify channels with regards to taking from Brazil or from Indonesia in that regard. And there are 3 to 4 factors together which are creating more and more issues, which is Russia, Ukraine, the tariff war, plus the Chinese control over this supply, in turn is creating a cascading effect where India has to now invest in critical minerals refining and exploration. It's not that India does not have anything, but India, even with 6.9 million tons of rare earth metals, does not have the technology to use those 30 critical minerals in that. That is where we don't have a cost effective way of refining these metals. Still, China has a pure monopoly over this sector, and India is trying to balance both China and the US in order to create a certain space where India does not directly get affected. Because India is a developing economy, any form of control over these metals will in turn have a cascading effect on our growth rate and growth story in that. So, if UPSC asks you a question like this, which is, and this is directly quoted from the newspaper, this is how UPSC asks questions sometimes, which is Beijing has enormous leverage over the entire world for a range of supply chains for critical raw and intermediate materials. Do you agree? Discuss the ways to mitigate this. Now, do understand one thing, do not fully agree on this, which is that yes, China is everything, we are doomed, we will die. No, not that type of an approach. What you have to do is you have to find a middle space. You will say yes, that China has, as of right now, a pure monopoly over the supply. It is the largest supplier and the holder of the rare earth metals by tonnage. However, India has its own, and India also has other bilateral relations with countries which have rare earth metal. And therefore, we have the capacity to diversify our supply chain. How to mitigate it? Bilateral agreements, refining in India itself, more exploration, which in turn can lead to India absorbing the supply chain disruption rather than being paralyzed by it. I hope this makes sense. You should just, in a way, try to create an understanding where India can absorb this rather than being paralyzed by it. Chinese dependence is there. You have to reduce it. China holds this key where it can purely shut down this whole economy. We have to make sure that, like we have energy security, energy reserves, we should have rare earth metal reserves, which allow us to develop in a case where China comes with this idea that we are not going to supply to anyone. So that is again problematic because China needs that export. It's an important export. Refining will only be cost effective if it is exported. But the idea is controlling that can in turn lead to price increase, which will be good for the Chinese itself. So it's a two-way street. There's one more article which deals with India and China. Very interesting one because written by an IFS officer, has very nuanced. We'll discuss that also. So I hope the first two articles are sorted. First one talked about the criticism of the judiciary. Does it stand? Second one talks about how text and context. This one talks about how rare earth metal supply chain has been disrupted and what is dependence of the Americans on it and how does it impact India in that regard. Interesting articles, all very relevant for UPSC. Sometimes we have a lot of irrelevant articles in Hindu newspaper nowadays. Very relevant article, not politically charged also. Now, the third article is equally interesting because it gives you a very interesting word which we don't talk about. We have the concept of circular economy, have the concept of renewable economy, we have the concept of green economy, but we don't talk about what is called as creative economy. Now, what is this creative economy in that regard, and how do we harness it? This is why you should know these terminologies. What does this creative economy mean? Creativity and innovation is something which go together, but are complementary to another. Meaning, you can be creative but may not be innovative. You can be innovative but by copying someone and not be creative. Now, yes, it's not per se knowledge economy. According to the UNCTAD, software services, research and development, advertising, market research, and architecture, all three hold the biggest percentage in creative economy. Meaning, anywhere you have creativity involved, which in turn leads to innovation, is the creative economy of the world. Now, you must think that if it is software research, software services, it would have a very big space within our world trade or world space itself. And it is. That is where we have the creative services at 1.4 trillion economy it is, and it is increasing at 29% since 2017. And collectively, the creative economy generates annual revenue of close to 2 trillion and 50 million jobs. At the same point of time, India also has a very important role here, wherein in 2019 itself, India's creative goods and exports totaled 121 million billion dollars, and India has the, you can say, the capacity to export more. The design segment itself had 87.5% creative goods export, and India has a as of right now it is valued at 30 billion dollars. It has the capacity to grow by 2x 3x. It is not specifically tertiary sector. Within the tertiary sector, wherever innovation is happening through creativity, the idea that you have software, which is a creative process of creating new softwares, the same point of time, architecture, marketing, research and development. Now, $30 billion in 2024 is good, but within an economy of 2 trillion, it is less. Now, the argument which this article makes is a very interesting one. See, we as Indians are very creative. We are quite creative. And we have a very interesting word which is used in India, and we have been called that multiple times. We have that jugaad economy. So we are able to use creativity to create new concepts which may not exist anywhere else. The concept that we are jugadu. We are able to bring two to three things together and then produce something which talked about. Nobody ever thought that we will be using cycles as washing machines. Nobody ever thought that we will use the motor of a scooter to have wheat mills itself, or what we call as grain mills. We are creative. But what the argument is made by the article is our creativity does not necessarily need to innovation. This is where our creativity is either being localized or not harnessed, and therefore it is creating a disjuncture with innovation. Meaning, innovation is happening across the world via the creativity of Indians, but we are not able to harness our creativity to produce innovation. This is where the article argues that India has created multiple creative ventures, ideas, but because we do not invest in this creativity, we are not able to innovate. Yes, Monu, that is also very true. That our creative solutions are makeshift. Our creative solutions sometimes are viable also, but we don't have lack of creativity. We have lack of innovation. And innovation, patenting, research and development needs money. And that is why you see the article is titled New Pathways for India's Creative Economy. That if we have to make sure that this $30 billion market share increases, we need to harness creativity and also link it with innovation. And this is where three things have been identified by the article which need to change. The first thing which needs to change is we do not have intellectual property right protection. Meaning, if a person innovates something through its creativity, we tend to not give them intellectual property right protection. In multiple cases, Westerners are using our technology, our jugards, calling them their technology. So what we are doing is we are creative, but we are not locking in that innovation. So therefore, the designs, the concepts are not protected by patents, are not protected by copyrights, which in turn lead to copy across the world or with in India itself. Second is we do not invest. IPR protection is not there. But what we also don't do is invest. And a very interesting case is given here for Indonesia. In Indonesia, schools were given a certain, you can say, project. Flooding was a very big issue in a certain city. Schools, the children were given a project, find a solution to the flooding issue in that city. You know what example which they actually used to find a solution for that? They used Indian ant behavior to come up with this idea that in very damp territories, what do ants do is that if they have a certain ant farm, they will create channels in and around that farm to make sure that if water comes through, it is directed away from the ant farm. This is an Indian ant behavior. Using an Indian ant as an example, they came up with a new innovation where water channels have been created so that water can be dispersed across the city and away from the city. It is not that our scientists are not working on it, but the idea is we are not giving them the space. And children are creative. So why not? You must have heard about this Atal Innovation Center, right? The Niti Aayog based scheme. Tell me any major innovation recently, even covered by the news, where Atal Innovation Centers were involved. Niti Aayog, Atal Innovation Centers. They are just namesake. They have created certain spaces where they are doing some form of innovation, which is not coming through. We have tinkering labs also. The idea is it cannot be that out of 1 lakh schools, only 5 have tinkering labs and Atal Innovation Centers. This creativity of at the grassroots level. This is one of the arguments. The creativity at the grassroots level is beyond exception. We have multiple mechanics in India. We have multiple engineers in India. We have multiple personalities in India who may not be IIT graduates or may not be engineering graduates, but they have created such solutions which can be patented to create very important solutions for India itself. So let's be very honest. For example, the use of ceramic or pottery based refrigerators is something which is we use pottery for cooling water for a very long time. We have this technology with us. We understand it. In a tropical country, torrid zone, the water evaporation causes cooling. We have been making water very, very cold for a very long time using pottery. We have now companies which are developing refrigerators based on the same technology. We have whole systems, green buildings, which are using the same principle to cool down the building. But it is not an Indian company which harnessed this idea, though it's an Indian concept itself. So the innovator and the creativity expert may be in your household, but we have to harness that idea. This is what this article talks about, that the investment into the creative space, but also innovation, where creativity uses and reaches its right destination, is extremely important. Now, for the examination, what really matters for you is this concept of creative economy. You can be caught off guard if you do not have an understanding of what this word means. And therefore, India needs to invest more in its creative economy. It can create a lot of distortion in your mind when you are trying to solve this question in the examination because you may misinterpret it. And therefore, you have to talk about the idea that yes, investment, IPR protection, and the concept of grassroots level creativity being pushed through as innovation is something which is very, very important. Something which is very, very important. A recent case, one company was closed. The Supreme Court has argued that the manufacturing of that watering water company should close because it was pure copying of Bisleri. Now, what does that show you? That is not innovation. That is copy. Even went on Shark Tank. But we have better solutions at the grassroots level for drinking water, which are not recognized because we do not have the right investment in. I hope you understand the point of this article. Gives you a lot of new information, gives you a terminology for the examination, and you also understand the importance of something. Clear, everyone? First three. Done? Okay. Now, now this article, if it was written by anyone else other than a former foreign secretary, I would have not taken this article because sometimes you have politically charged articles which make no sense whatsoever for a UPSC aspirant. Maybe a very good read, but a UPSC aspirant has to understand what type of information he or she consumes. Now, this one is very interesting because this article is based out of a lecture given by her, Rupama Rao, at a very elite school about India and China relationship at the juncture of 75 years of contact. And very recently, she talked about a very interesting solution to a standard problem which we have. Now, what I want from you is I would like to develop the whole concept in front, how she argues it. And then I would want to give you the basic crux of it and how you use it in the exam. Can we do that? Basically, there's a lot of nuance in this article. I will develop it the way she develops it, and then we'll take out the crux for our right. Now, the first thing which she says is that India and China, 75 years of diplomatic ties, it's a commemorative milestone, but it is a story where Asian solidarity became into Asian conflict, and the relationship is little bit complicated. If that is the word which she wants to use, is complicated. Now, let's try to develop what she wants to argue. She says that Indian foreign policy, pay attention, Indian foreign policy or policy making in three sectors. Solidarity means brotherhood. In three sectors, which is border, infrastructure, which is trade, and third is defense cooperation. She argues that in these three spaces, everything is valued via a China lens. Now, what does the China lens mean? She argues for that for India, China, as of right now, is the single most influential external factor in policy making in these three areas. Makes a lot of sense also. Previously, Pakistan used to be a very important consideration, is still, but China has become a very important consideration. Meaning, in external factors which dictate our border infrastructure, our trade policy, and our defense cooperation, balancing China or China is a very important external factor, something which is always in context. So, what she argues is that the Chinese lens is always used to understand or go forward in any of these zones. trade, be it defense, be it border infrastructure. Not something new, but very well articulated in the sense that the Chinese lens has to be used once to see the policy itself. Now she argues that this relationship started with Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, the concept of Panchsheel, with solidarity, which is coming together. However, there are multiple irritants which have developed over a long period of time, which is 62 in 61-62 war, first. Second is the 2020 Galwan Valley standoff. Then we have the issues related to the Brahmaputra Dam. It's called as the Yarlung Zangpo Dam itself. And over and above that, the LAC issue, because LAC, unlike the LOC, is not internationally recognized line. And there have been attempts made by the Chinese to push this line towards or into India in that regard. Then we have Doklam, we have Bongangso, multiple irritants. And recently, there is the Bangladesh issue, where the Bangladesh interim government argued that Northeast is landlocked and China is welcome to have investments and use Bangladesh in that regard. And we also have the issue of a very interesting case. All these irritants are based on national security and defense. But at the same point of time, we have an extremely skewed relationship with China in trade, where there is a deficit, there's a dependence, and there's close to imbalance of $100 billion. Close to $100 billion, there's an imbalance. Again, all the arguments as pushed by the author. So whilst there are defense considerations, there's also a trade imbalance, which means that India is also intertwined with the Chinese when it comes to economic logic. So when it comes to economic logic, at this given point of time, we cannot fully just cut our relationship with the Chinese, because we have a dependence on the Chinese for certain minerals, for certain rare earth metals, for certain goods. Meaning, you cannot be in isolation in the economic, but there is also a defense angle where national security and defense, you can say border infrastructure, and the way they are acting in this sector also dictates our understanding. Now, this is where the complicated relationship starts to develop. The complicated relationship is when I add these two concepts, which is the defense issue along with the trade imbalance. And now, further, she says, if I add one more person into this concept, it becomes even more complicated. It's Trump. Name is Trump. Trump and the US further complicate this relationship because Trump is finicky. Finicky? Tell you that. He talks about unilateralism. At the same point of time, talks about cooperation, bilateral cooperation. He's the one who's now shaking the tree of geopolitics in the world as of right now. He's doing unilaterally changing the trade regime. Trump, see, if it was Obama or maybe Biden, it was still predictable. US is a unpredictable power. It's a finicky power. It's a moody power. Today we are everything for America. India, India. Tomorrow, who India? Standard. This is not something new. If you look at the whole, you can say the whole summary of the relationship of the US with India in that regard, you will see this finickiness, moodiness, that sometimes we are the best, sometimes we are the worst. So we have Quad relationship also, but when it came to tariff, we were also under that tariff regime, but people started to find a silver lining in that. But the idea is unpredictability is something which is part of US and Trump relationship. This means that we cannot fully rely on the Americans. Quad relationship is based on a US led understanding of balancing China in the Indo Pacific. But we have to also not be in that case where this trade war also China sees us as a pure ally like a NATO member and then gives us 200%, 400% tariff. This is what what our foreign minister calls all alignment. We have to align with China also because we have an economic interdependence with it. And at the same point of time, we also have to develop this concept where we also have to balance China in defense. Now, this is what she calls a very complex, interconnected, intertwined relationship. Meaning, we cannot just live off the US, which we don't need to. We cannot fully trust the US. We also have to have certain cooperation with China because it is where the economic logic lies. And this is where she argues that a new approach is needed. And even our prime minister has realized that. She quotes the fact that the prime minister invoked words which were not previously used in Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis China, which is where he's argued of what we call as ancient synergy. The words which the prime minister has used is ancient synergy, where he's using the concept of Buddhism, soft power, to argue that we have cooperated previously. Very recently, he's argued that it should be healthy competition. And he's also argued that we should have mutual growth. These words were taken, yes, in a podcast, were taken very positively by the Chinese also, where the Chinese foreign minister has argued we like the pragmatic approach of India. See, in a complicated world which Trump has created, there is a need to have a more nuanced approach. And this is where she creates her problem statement. The problem statement is we use the Chinese lens to understand border infrastructure, trade, and defense cooperation. We have irritants in this relationship, but we also are dependent on China in that regard. We also have US and Trump, which complicate this relationship. And the complicated nature of this relationship, along with Trump politics, is leading to us to pivot, to change our approach, where the Chinese are also now singing a song which we've not heard previously. And our prime minister has also argued that it is Asian cooperation which will take everybody forward. So, therefore, then what should be our approach? Now, as a foreign secretary, she gives us a very interesting solution. This is what you will use in the examination. The four pillars which should dictate, which should dictate the Indian foreign policy towards China. And she uses a very interesting word, which should be our approach. Now, the first pillar she argues is military preparedness. Very pragmatic, very beautiful approach, which is we should always be prepared for Chinese incursion in LAC, along the LAC, in Ladakh, in the Arunachal sector. It's not that we do the mistake which Nehru did, where he had too much faith on Mao, too much faith on the Chinese relationship and the balancing of the USSR, China, US, and India at that point of time. We cannot ever discount to the fact that India always needs to be militarily prepared to face off the Chinese to give a befitting reply to any form of LAC based incursion. This means you keep the bat ready if it is needed. Like every Delhiwala has that hockey stick in the car. You have to have that hockey stick in that car because you never know when the Chinese are going to overtake us or undercut us. Second, economic diversification. Something which we just recently discussed in the second article. We need to diversify our supply chain. We have to diversify our production. We have to diversify our importing destination. There is no doubt about this. Again, a strategy which does not say that we remain just dormant, not passive. Third, very interesting concept, diplomatic engagement. This is something which has recently led to joint patrolling along the LAC in January of 2020 to 2025, which is a victory for diplomacy in this relationship. Meaning, through diplomatic engagement, we create a positive outlook. Because with Trump in perspective, we cannot be purely negative towards the Chinese. And last but not the least is narrative control. Being an IFS officer, being a bureaucrat, she understands controlling the narrative about China in India and India about China in the world is extremely important. Basically, it should not be that US says India is standing with us, we will fight till the end. And here India has taken a stance that it wants to cooperate with the Chinese. And we should not be pulled into Trump rhetoric because Trump does not think before he acts. It should not be that the narrative in China should be that we are supporting Trump in order to do what he's trying to do. That has been very well done by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, that they are controlling the narrative quite a lot. They're saying, yes, he's gone mad, he's doing what he's doing, but we are also getting 10%. We also got 25% suspended now, whatever it is. It is equally important to control the narrative of India towards China in America, which is America should not think that we have become pro China, which will never happen. But the idea is Trump should not think that India and China together are fighting. And therefore, if I'm putting 245% tariff on China, I will put 245% on India also. Now, this is where she says if you take all these four things together, a very beautiful terminology she has argued. What we need to do is we should have an approach, and she is the one who is advocating this approach quite a lot, is called competitive coexistence. Competitive coexistence. The fact that we also need to compete with China, but also coexist with China. And our argument is based on the fact that in defense, infrastructure, regional influence, we should compete. We should compete. But at the same point of time, in trade and world geopolitics, we need to coexist. And India has been doing that. If you actually look at it, competitive is Quad, but coexistence is SCO BRICS. He says India has been doing this for a very long time without an approach spelled out. That approach now needs to be spelled out, which is SCO and BRICS should also balance Quad, and the global South rhetoric should be used for competitive coexistence. This is where this article is extremely nuanced and very beautifully written. She gave this lecture in the US itself. And she argued that if India is able to follow this policy of competitive coexistence, India has a chance to control the narrative also, have a diplomatic engagement also. It can economically diversify its relationship with China and also have military preparedness, wherein we don't just do active resistance, we don't just do no resistance, we do passive resistance. I hope you've heard this word passive resistance previously, which is we resist but by non-engagement. We resist, we use the China lens in order to complicate our relationship with it, but we should not forget, and this is the argument she argues, which he puts through, is we should not forget that there is a lot of interdependence and you can say intertwined relationship economically, and economic logic is very, very important. So our nationalistic rhetoric, which is the national security rhetoric, should not dominate the economic, and the economic should not dominate the national security. I hope you understand how well she has developed. Is one of she's a foreign secretary, so obviously she will do that. But how a bureaucratic mind works. She's giving you the best perspective, a middle path in which competitive coexistence of India and China can be there. That is why what is the word she uses? India and China at 75 should not be based on sentiment, should be based on strategy. And this strategy is something which can make sure that India can grow and also compete with the Chinese at the same point. Makes sense. Beautifully written article. Lot of layers. I've tried to decode it. Two things you have to do, which is you have to use these concepts of what we today call as irritants to talk about the concept of Nirupama Rao. Nirupama Rao. Very celebrated foreign secretary. Former now. Now, you can get a question like this directly out of the newspaper. Asia can no longer solely rely on the US leadership in an era of global disruption. It needs a homegrown security architecture where India and China act as custodians of stability. Very nice terminology used, which is security architecture, stability, custodian, global disruption. This is how you argue as an IS officer, as an IFS officer. Not that we kill Maro Kato, no. Very nuanced. Not saying that we just surrender to the Chinese, we compete, but we also have to understand our larger interest here. So I hope these four articles, two out of text and context, and two out of the editorials, have given you a nuanced perspective and something new to think, which is the concept of judiciary, then China, then rare earth metals, and the concept of what we today call as this creative economy. Right? Perfect. What shows Quad and SU in competitive? Because Quad it does not have any China, BRICS has and SU has China. So we are competing with China through Quad, but we're cooperating with China through BRICS and SU. Okay. Now we have lost yesterday a very important personality in the world, the spiritual leader of all the Christians across the world, Pope Francis. Now, when it comes to the resurrection of the image of the church, Pope Francis played a very important role, meaning the Catholic Church, with its controversy and the way it has conducted itself across America, and a lot of different things which are associated. He was the one who, in 2013, when he became the Pope, he started to change how the church should look at the world itself. He was an Italian immigrant into Argentina, and he then joins the Jesuit order. He already had a lung pneumonia issue through which he died also yesterday. Yes, he's the first Latin American pope, non-European pope. And since he came to this you can say office, if you want to call it, he made a lot of amends. For example, in Canada, he apologized in a way for the way the indigenous population was used by the church and how they were abused by the church. He was the first one to appoint a nun, Sister Brambilla, as the head of Vatican department overseeing religious orders. First woman to do that. He also is a person who spoke about climate change, same-sex marriage, and other different aspects. Now he will be remembered as Pope Francis. He named himself after Saint Francis of Assisi, the Pope, who's known to be very simplistic. He was also one personality. He has a very good relationship with India also. Our Prime Minister, we have 3 days mourning also. But when we talk about his very important moments in which he showed that the church is also evolving. For example, for the first time, he said that this global indifference towards refugees needs to be removed. He's an immigrant himself. He said that this global indifference towards immigrants should not be there. Then he also talked about how US Mexican border, how Trump was acting in his first term is not like a Christian. It is building a wall to keep immigrants out, is not being a Christian. That's not a Christian value in that regard. He also talked about the 12 Syrian Muslim refugees and how they were treated in the Greece sector. Lot of slack he also got. He's a personality who was always criticized by the Orthodox Christian community also. When it came to same-sex marriages and the LGBTQ plus community in that regard, he said, "Who am I to judge?" The Pope saying that is extremely interesting. And he was also the one who said that being homosexual is not a crime. When he was asked about a gay uh, bishop, a gay priest, he said, "I am not the one who will judge him." And in his Praised Be, he talked about how we are destroying the earth. And this is where he talked about climate change and global warming. The church believing in what is called as the idea that everything was uh, it's called the creationist theory, that it was not evolution. Church has for a very long time denied evolution as a process, but the idea that he is arguing that we are creating this global economic system which is destroying the earth itself is also quite nuanced. He's one of the first popes to use scientific data, to use it in his church documents. So Pope Francis was not just a random pope, or is not a controversial pope. He will always be remembered for his simplicity, for his love, but also for very, very hard hitting decisions he took and also changed the perspective of the church on multiple things. Now, this will introduce a whole cycle of the new pope being elected. We will see that black smoke and white smoke coming out of the Vatican very soon. But he is a person who will be remembered kindly by history. And maybe he was the person who the church needed to evolve itself with evolving times. The church has been evolving for now centuries, from not accepting science to a pope using scientific data to argue in Praised Be, is purely the evolution of important institutions. So I hope you realize how important he was, and the 3 day mourning which is going to happen in India today is purely justified. Purely justified. Because he was not just a spiritual leader, he was the image of what we call as church in front of everyone, and what the Christian world should embody to be in that regard. So remember this point. It is quite significant how he affected geopolitics as well. Yes. Okay. Moving on. We have repeated something which we had done in December and January of 2024 and 2025. To this SpaceX mission, we wanted to dock and undock two satellites together. The ISRO has successfully docked and undocked SDX-01 and SDX-02 for the second time, which in turn confirms our position as the fourth country to do it after the US, Russians, and the Chinese. Now, SpaceX or docking undocking is an extremely important part of our moon mission, of any mission where there's a manned component, Gaganyaan, and therefore this demonstration is extremely important because this establishes our technology and ISRO's prowess in doing something like this. We have now confirmation of this technology, this process. The last topic which I want to discuss with you is the concept of the nature's fury as seen in Jammu and Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir highway, along with the multiple, you can say 12 different villages, and 21 different villages have now got affected by the flash floods, the landslip which has happened. This is something which will go on further. Cloudburst with uh, perpetual rain for the past 3 days, in turn, has led to this. Only shows you the fragility of the infrastructure in this sector. This is something which you should be cognizant of. And Jammu Kashmir, as of right now, needs the help of the center. It is a UT, but it needs help from all the stakeholders because close to close to 120 cars and all critical essential goods were in a way disrupted because of this. Meaning food, fuel disruption in close to 10 to 12 villages is something which is predicted. And therefore, this is something which shows you how the infrastructure in these sectors in a way is fragile. And be it Himachal Pradesh, be it Uttarakhand, be it Jammu and Kashmir, be it this whole belt Arunachal, this is where the real vulnerability and climate change based extreme weather events are happening, will in turn lead to disruptions in this sector, something which will develop further and we'll keep on giving you an update. But our thoughts with all the people in this sector. Okay, on this note, we'll end this session. I hope that you have been able to pick up at least 4 to 5 new terminologies, this very nuanced concept of how to balance China coming out of an IFS officer itself, and how to write an answer on the judiciary in a nuanced way. Because writing an answer on the judiciary in a nuanced way is very important because you cannot be disrespectful towards the judiciary in that regard. And together with rare earth metals and everything else, this session has been fruitful. You understood things also, but you revised them also. So I hope that this discussion will help you develop your understanding for mains. Thank you so much. I will see you tomorrow. Take care.